All right, guys, welcome to our next lecture, and we're going to cover the second half of McKay chapter 12 in this lecture, Europe and Renaissance, and we're going to focus not so much on the art that is covered in the first part of this reading, because we're going to get into that in class a little more in the coming days, but I want to focus a little bit more on social, political, religious stuff. So first thing they talk about in this setting anyway is the debate about women. It's a little bit different than the order in your book, but that's okay. So follow along. So remember that women had been pretty much identified, throughout history. I mean, more or less as associated with the home, with raising children. The biggest job that they have is to care and nurture family members. And as it says in the book, most women were either considered either married or to be married. When they did work outside the home, they were paid about half as much as men for similar work. For upper class women, actually, their status declined during the Renaissance. They had actually had more rights under feudal law. Humanists see the place of a wife is in the home, and of course they're excluded from the public arena. They can't hold really any political office. You read about how they were excluded from the world of art and architecture as well. They did have enormous responsibilities around the house, so believe me when I tell you that that was a full-time job. On to slavery and ethnicity, the concept of race in the Renaissance, again, was different than it is today. The word slave comes from Slav, and a lot of the slaves of the High Middle Ages were people from Eastern European countries who were of Slavic origin, Slavic nationality, so that's kind of where the word derives from. In the 1300s, the Italian city-states had dominated the slave trade. When political instability rakes the east and further into Russia, the taking of slaves is allowed. So I mean, there's a ton of political instability in the eastern, modern day eastern countries of Europe and in Russia, and slaves are captured in battle. By the 15th century, we start to see large numbers of slaves of African origin entering into Europe, and these people are mostly captured by the Portuguese, who have begun to explore along the coast of Africa, and they're bringing these slaves back in raids. Slaves in Europe were pretty widely scattered, especially black slaves, and African people in Europe were kind of a curiosity during the Renaissance, as they had been during the Middle Age. Of the ones who were there, most live on the Iberian Peninsula, of course, which is part of Spain. A lot of times you'll see Africans featured in Renaissance art, and it was a status symbol, so when the people were having their portraits painted to show how wealthy they were, to show their prestige in society, a lot of times they would include these servants, servants of African origin, to show just how well off they were. And by the 1500s, of course, the flow of slaves from Africa has increased. Black slavery in particular, never takes off in Europe the way that it does in the Americas, and that's partly because they don't have a huge agricultural economy like they have in the American South. It's like a staple crop type deal that needs labor. Renaissance ideas in Italy catch on and spread. It's like, the newest way of thinking. So by the last part of the 1400s, students from all over Europe have begun to flock to Italy for this new learning, this humanist learning that has taken off, this new type of art that has become prevalent in Italy and in the city-states like Venice. And they take a lot of these Renaissance ideals back to where they came from. Of course, they take the Italian notion of humanism and these thoughts about the individual, the classics, and the importance of how those are interpreted, and sort of blend those and mold those with their own traditions. What we're going to wind up seeing in art and thought in Italy, it's a more secular kind of place, and probably more pagan, a little more attached to those Roman classical roots. In the northern Renaissance countries, as the rest of Western Europe, north of Italy is generally known as, they remain a little bit more religious. Here's a very famous piece of art by a painter named Vermeer, a Dutch painter, and that one's called "Girl with the Pearl Earring." So humanist thought in the north is as I mentioned, a bit different. Christian ideals, do still play a major role. And humanists in the North combine those Christian sort of principles with classical ideas, and particularly things like calmness, stoicism, and broad-mindedness. And they marry those with Christian ideologies like love, faith, and hope. They talk about reason and how it's important to use over just a straight acceptance of religious dogma as fact. and they believe in the power of people. That humanist belief that people are fundamentally good and they can learn if they're educated. Thomas More is probably England's leading Renaissance humanist thinker. He had served in he will serve in Henry VIII's court. He's a lawyer, and his sort of masterpiece work is called Utopia, where he visualizes a society where private property is eliminated. There aren't any more wars, and he says the key to improve society is to correct the problems in social institutions that drive the behavior of individuals. This is his sort of driving thought, to fix society, and that will help correct individual behavior. Another important Northern Renaissance or Northern European humanist is a guy named Erasmus. He is from the Netherlands. His main works involve Christianity and how Christianity and humanism can be combined. So again, combining like the classic mindset, the belief in the potential of the individual, and Christian ideology. And his probably two most important works are Education of a Christian Prince, which talks about how Christian European kings should be educated in the classics. The other is The Praise of Folly, which questions the abuses of the church and its worldliness. He sees education as a means to reform, and he says that through education, humans can and be improved morally and intellectually. And he also argues that Christianity is Christ, and that the inner spirit is what matters, that connection, and not rituals or ceremony or law. So he's sort of in the same framework as Wycliffe and Huss when he talks about these things. Northern art and architecture we're going to talk about a little bit more going forward. It's again characterized by religion. It's sort of the overarching theme, but also the individual. Not as influenced by the classic style, especially architecturally. A lot of classic architecture in Italy that goes back to the Greek and Roman traditions. We're not going to see that as much in Northern Europe. Painters like Jan van Eyck are going to be really incredibly realistic in their works. He's one of the first to work with oils, and he really sort of captures the human personality. And again, it's humanist, right? Renaissance politics are driven by the aggressive methods. I mean, a lot of these guys could have read Machiavelli. Louis the XI of France, Henry the VII of England, Ferdinand of Aragon, all ruthless, and morality is second to results for these guys. So what we're going to see is, the sort of thought process of the Machiavellian concept of what a prince should be, in action. And these new monarchs are going to serve as sovereigns to bind their people and their country. Charles pulls France out of the turmoil of the Hundred Years' War, drives the rest of the English away, and actually begins the first permanent royal army that's paid like a professional army. His son, Louis the Spider, as he's called, continues his plots and his expansion and consolidates those French holdings. And when the Pope and King Francis I of France signed the Concordat of Bologna, the king from that point forward gets to pick the bishops and abbots in France. So that's a really powerful sort of influence that he gets. In return, the Pope gets the first year of those guys' pay. So he basically is bought off in exchange for the king of France being able to appoint those religious officials, and it gives the king a ton of power over the church. In England, after the Hundred Years' War, there's a lot of turmoil. The War of the Roses is an English civil war between the houses of York and Lancaster. The Yorkists win initially, but the King Richard III is killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field by Henry Tudor, who becomes the first Tudor monarch of England and becomes known as King Henry VII. The Tudors are pretty smart in that they undercut the Parliament's powers by not calling Parliament. And the way they avoid doing this is that they don't really conduct any expensive wars. And by doing that, they avoid having to call Parliament and ask for funds. So this is a move that they employ. Another thing they do is they quell any kind of noble resistance by use of a secret court known as the Star Chamber. And if you were a noble who spoke out against the Tudors, you might find yourself in this place. And there was no jury. There was one judge, and that was the king, more or less. And you could be forced to confess under torture. So it was not a good place to find yourself. As we mentioned here, Henry undercuts Parliament. He creates a royal council to handle most of the government governing on a national level.